Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Bearable Bull here. And I got this aggressively average content for you today. As man, oh man, do I have a different type of video for you guys today. Today, I met with Mr. Peter St. Onge, PhD economist. Someone who I deeply respect in the entire space. He is an individual I've been following for quite a while and talks a lot about the macro, talks a lot about the things that we discuss on this channel every single day. Is a freedom-minded Austrian economist and someone whose intellect I think all of you need to tap into. You know what's actually interesting is that he doesn't necessarily like XRP too much. He's more on the Bitcoin side of crypto than the XRP side of crypto. But what's so interesting is that two individuals that may disagree on a digital asset actually have a great conversation and actually end up agreeing on more things than you could imagine without yelling at each other, while having deep insights and while also trying to change each other's minds. I think this is one of those interviews that you guys are going to love a lot, as he has a depth of knowledge that we all need to appreciate deeply, and I highly recommend all of you give him a follow. Now guys, without further ado, I hope you all enjoy this interview with Mr. Peter St. Onge. We are now live. 3, 2, 1, go. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone from across the world. I have a very special guest for every single one of you. I've used his clips, as some of you may know, in a couple videos because I think his knowledge on macro, CBDCs, and also Bitcoin as well is excellent. And I think we're going to dive into a couple very powerful topics. For people that don't know, Peter, you're a little bit of a Bitcoiner, but you also like your metals and a couple other things. I want people to get to know you a little bit. Can you share your background and what it is you do and how you got into this whole space as a whole?
Sure. So I'm an economist, and I believe in the Austrian School of Economics, which I think is really true economics. I think Keynesian is a bastard mutant hybrid that should be eliminated.
We
so
can
I would call
agree there,
myself a
my friend.
true, so I'm a true economist, meaning that I'm an Austrian. And therefore, like most Austrians, I'm very interested in hard money and the various ways that that could fix a lot of the troubles that we have in the world right now. Things like inflation, recessions, bank crashes, reserve currency issues. I think really it's the source of a lot of the problems that we have today. So I work at Heritage Foundation. I'm also a fellow at the Mises Institute as a former professor in Taiwan, which actually hires libertarians because Taiwan is not yet woke. Thank goodness. There are still outposts of sanity on Earth.
Oh, let's hope it stays that way, right?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, well, both Japan, Korea, Taiwan are islands of sanity. There are other places, of course, like Eastern Europe, but it is a shrinking number of places that are still sane.
Yeah. Oh, that's tough, but I appreciate you sharing. And for people that don't know, you are a Bitcoiner as well, right? You're not the biggest fan of altcoins, and I'm actually on the other side of the spectrum. I'm a very big XRP dude. I believe that it will play a future role in the financial system. And just so people can understand a little bit, what's your take on XRP in general? Do you like it, hate it, think it's a piece of shit, banker coin, all of the above?
Generally speaking, for a long time, I had been, sort of neutral towards it.
Sure.
I think that there's a place for sort of crypto as a rail. I think that for the vast majority of people, they're going to want stable coins for the same reason that people use their own national currency. It's just lower transaction costs to use a stable coin. So I just sort of assumed that stable coins were going to continue eating Ripple's lunch. But I mean, I didn't have any animosity towards it. That's actually changed recently now because Ripple is pushing very hard for CBDCs. They're specifically trying to get, let's see, they've got a pilot program in Hong Kong. They're doing a big marketing push on it where they are trying to convince countries to install CBDCs. And, of course, countries have no capability in crypto. They don't have any capability in central banking to start with, never mind crypto-based.
Yes, yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, Ripple's trying to sell itself as kind of a contractor to build the digital prison. So, if they would let go of that, then, we could go back to neutrality. But at the moment, I'm not real thrilled with Ripple as a company.
I kind of have the same mentality, my friend, believe it or not. Like
Okay.
as much as I discuss it daily on my channel, I'm a very freedom-minded person. I'm not someone trying to report on the masses, yes, CBDCs are good. On the contrary, I live in Florida where they just banned central bank digital currencies. I love that
Yep.
state.
Beautiful.
I think they've done a lot of great things, but I'm also an absolute realist. And I have, especially over the past 3 years, I have minimal faith in humanity to be able to resist the eventual tyranny that may come. I also think it's inevitable, right? So I'm just hedging my bets as a person, and I'm saying, okay, these central banks control the trillions of dollars in the world, and we're peons. We can do almost nothing to resist it, aside from maybe hedging our bets a little bit, getting wealthy in the meantime, and just bringing awareness and trying to stop it. So I'm invested in XRP, but I hate CBDC. So I know it's kind of strange, right? But
It's
that's really
tricky at
my
the
thing.
moment. Yes.
It's very tricky. I know. I know.
And, this is a problem really across the board. So I'm, as an economist, I'm broadly pro-business, free market, but
Yeah.
it's a truth of life that, you'll have some small company that's getting shut out by the big guys. The oligopoly is crushing them. And you go to bat for these guys. You stand up for them. You say, you oligopolists, let down that bridge. You got to let this guy come in. All right.
Yeah.
And the guy that you're championing, he gets in there, and the first thing the bastard does is pull the ladder up after him. And I'll tell you, boy, it is discouraging sometimes. I'm
I
like,
know.
we fought for you. I remember H&R Block specifically, they were getting shut out because they were the new guy and they were the innovator.
Yeah.
And the big four accounting companies were trying to get regulatory rules. And then finally H&R Block gets in, and the first thing they do is try to shut out everybody else. So it's
Unbelievable, right?
it's I mean, I understand why they do it. Companies have a responsibility to their shareholders, but it just
Yes.
reminds you that companies are psychopaths. They're not as bad as governments, but yes, they are psychopaths.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with that psychopathic nature in mind, I think we're suffering from psychopathic economics right now. I have a saying on my channel, and I call it fantasy economics are at play, because everything's distorted. We're having inflation, but also interest rate hikes, but also they're gonna pause, but also I think collapses are coming. And something I really like doing is getting a lot of people from different levels of experience, different perspectives, and things like that. So I'm very curious to know, with your knowledge of the markets and the economy as a whole, like, what do you see going on, especially here at home, and how that's affecting the world as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple, which is that the left saw an opportunity in COVID to really expand their power over every aspect of society. But in order to get that power, they needed the lockdowns. And,
Yes.
normally if you get up on stage and you suggest to a country that you're going to shut it down and everybody's going to lose their job and everybody's business is going to get crushed, it's not a real popular, platform. And
Hmm.
so they had to buy those lockdowns. And the way they did that was with UBIs for the general
Yeah.
population in almost every country. And specifically in the US, an effective UBI for companies called the
Hmm.
PPP program. So, they just handed out money like candy, trillions upon trillions,
Yeah.
unprecedented amount of money that they spent in order to buy those lockdowns. And a lot of us during the
Unemployment,
lockdowns,
all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of us were shocked at the time. We were like, what is wrong with American voters? Like, how could this possibly be popular? You were crushing the entirety of society, and of course, part of that was their propaganda to scare everybody. But another big part of it was that people were being paid to sit on the couch, or, journalists were being paid to chill out at home in their underwear. And so that's tempting. From their
How much?
perspective, there was not much cost. Blue collar people couldn't go to work, it's true, but then of
Yeah.
course they got these big handouts in pretty much every country in the world. So that was kind of the original sin. And once you pump that much money out, it's going to cause inflation. Every school of economics knows that. Even the Keynesian bozos know that, if you pump that much money out. There was one point where about $1 in $3 had just been printed. So of course that's going to cause enormous inflation. At that point, what they could have done, if they were responsible and public minded, is they could have basically stood up to Congress and said, no more. We've let you guys run. The emergency is over. The pandemic's over. And so we are going, not only are we going to stop buying new government debt, we're going to start selling it down. We're going to do it really fast, right? That would have put pressure on Congress to end the deficits. That would have then pulled all of that money sloshing around, right? It would have pulled it out, and that would have brought inflation down on its own. Instead, they didn't do that. They didn't stand up to Congress at all. They just continued what they always do, which is licking the boot. And, so how do you stop inflation if you're not willing to cut the government spending? Well, you've got to crush the rest of us. You've got to crush the wider economy. And, again, every school of economics knows how to kill an economy. You hike rates, you hike them real fast. So that's what he did. He crushed the private economy, wiped out jobs. He was very open about it. He said there are too many jobs. So wipe out the jobs, basically clear the highways so that the feds can keep driving at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of observations that I've been making as a whole. And some of them include, I feel like the United States is going towards too much of a socialistic country, unfortunately, right? And I'm over here in Eastern Europe at the moment, and I've actually been doing a large amount of research on the fall of Yugoslavia and how that was a socialistic nation. And when you talk to people from there, they're like, I can't believe the United States is going down this path.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they need to stop before it's too late. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on how much of that is the Trump effect, that he was so polarizing that people are willing to just do the opposite and conform with the narrative as opposed to doing what's best for a country. Because I feel like that simple as a whole is just destructive, whether you like him or not. But it's been destructive for the other side as much as it has been for the policies that have been enacted as a counter to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the other side went crazy for sure. I don't think it's so much that Trump was polarizing. I think what happened was that for at least a generation since the 1960s, the left has been convinced that they're going to inherit the world, that nothing will stand in their way, that they are inevitable, that socialism is going to win. And what happened is that in brief succession, we had two events. We had Brexit, and then just a couple months later, we had Trump winning. And in both cases, the entire socialist infrastructure of society was dead set against them, right? There was the mother of all fear campaigns claiming that both are going to be Armageddon, and yet it didn't work. The brainwashing from the schools, the universities, the media, the official institutions, the unofficial institutions, things like the American Medical Association, there's just this endless series of institutions that in theory are independent, but really, they tend to toe the government line. The entirety of this was deployed against Brexit and against Trump, and yet the people voted for it. I think that freaked them out. I think that's why they overplayed their hand on COVID. I think they essentially panicked, and they decided that time is not on their side, right? That the revolution is not inevitable. The, Britain pulling out of the EU itself was one of the proudest achievements of the international socialists. And to have not only a country drop out, right? This was not like Portugal or Greece that got kicked out because they were.
It's Britain. It's the UK.
Yeah. This was arguably the first or second most important country in the entire union that dropped out. And so they panicked, they freaked out. they had been sort of quietly brainwashing generation after generation, but they'd been doing it quietly and they'd been relatively sane. And at this point, you know, it's almost like you're implanting your fifth column into the city that you intend to take. And you do that real slowly. You put your guys in there, you stick them in here and there, you do your little Trojan horse. And at some point, if you feel like they know and time is no longer on your side, then you go with what you got. And I think that's exactly what they did. So the media showed their hand, the you know, universities, K to 12, the education bureaucracy showed their hand. All of them, they sort of launched too early. They weren't entirely ready to take over everything, but they had to go because they suddenly realized that time was now against them for whatever reason that people were turning on them. And I think that's built into socialism. I call it socialism's the Zeno paradox of socialism. Okay, so Zeno's paradox says that if you're trying to approach a wall, it's 10 feet away, right? So first you cover the 5 feet, and then you cover the 2.5 feet, and then you cover the 1.25 feet, and you keep covering half, 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 but you never actually get there. Okay, and you know, this is sort of a philosophical game. And I think what happens in socialism is that the problem is that it is so bad. The performance of socialism is so terrible, right? You start running out of food, the electricity doesn't work anymore, crime skyrockets because the government becomes incompetent. And so what happens that as you get closer to socialism, more and more people start getting disgusted with it. So every time you get halfway to socialism, now you have more people who are pissed off at you. You get halfway closer, now you got even more people. You get halfway, at some point, forget it, you're rejected. And so I think that it was always inevitable, but Brexit and Trump showed that we had reached the point where socialism is, it basically ground to a halt. So they had to go with what they had. In a sense, I'm glad they did. It's been very uncomfortable for all of us these past couple of years in a variety of ways.
I think a lot of people have woken up to the fact that that's what they were doing. And especially now with the ESG, DEI, CEI, all these social credit things, I am cautiously optimistic, Peter. I promise you, I'm cautious. I had lost complete hope the past 3 years in humanity, but over the past couple months with the boycotts that we've been seeing on certain companies like Bud Light, for example, and things like that, I'm like, okay, we're affecting markets now. Like the pushback is real. And I think if they can affect some companies' bottom lines and show that this is not the way, I think that that's, if the open markets can do that, I think there's a chance, right? Because I think that ESG is inevitable. I think CBDCs are inevitable. I think AI is inevitable. I think they're going to try their best to put us in a digital control grid, right? And I think to a certain degree that's going to work in some places, right? And I think you could guess which places those are going to be. I'm born and raised in New York, and it is a digital prison. I go 26 miles an hour down the street, they mail me a nice ticket directly to my door. Right? That's the system in place right there. Right? So it's one of those things where I'd see it coming, and I'm curious to know, genuinely, I'm very concerned that over the next couple months we're going to see a systemic failure, right? Genuinely. I don't, and when I say that, I mean a crash of epic proportions that people may be blindsided by, because what we saw was a complete lockdown of the economy, money printing unlike anything we've ever seen before. The stock market is having a nice little party right now irrationally for no reason, and I don't think we've seen the correction that we need to see. And I think whatever happens is going to be very, very panicky. 08 style maybe worse. I'm curious to know if you see something along those lines coming down the road, and how you're preparing for that.
Yeah, normally I think that would be true. A lot of things that are unsustainable have sort of accelerated in and become far more unsustainable. A lot of things are going a lot faster than they used to. So bank runs now occur in hours, whereas they used to occur in weeks. Also, the magnitudes are just enormous. You know, even if we compare the amount of debt swimming around, say, the US versus 2008, it's much, much bigger. I think that what argues against that is that on the other side of it, they had traditionally held off on using the money so aggressively. I can't think of a case where they had done anything like COVID, where they basically bought a crisis. Of course, things like World War II had comparable rates of money generation. But, to sort of entrepreneurially seek out what was basically a bad flu and to turn that into a world-changing crisis, that's never happened. And I think what really gave them the confidence to do that was 2008, right? 2008, they pumped out so much money. It was just breathtaking at the time. And so I think that where we are right now is that because they've discovered those tens of trillions at their disposal, trillions of dollars for any government facing a crisis, they're sort of like arrows in the quiver. Okay.
Yes.
And previously they didn't realize they had them because the entire financial community would have been really disturbed if they had whipped out that kind of money just randomly in, say, the 1990s. But at this point, after 2008, they've sort of crossed that line and they feel comfortable doing that. And, if we look at what just happened a couple months ago with the banks, for example, the banks started falling like dominoes. Initially, they were falling. The collapses were bigger than they were in 2008. And then all of a sudden it stopped. And it stopped because they effectively pre-bailed out every bank in America to the tune of, literally tens of trillions of dollars. They basically called up every bank. Well, they announced that every bank, they can lend. So if the bank has an asset that's gone down in value, let's say they bought a bond for $1 and now it's worth 60 cents, the Fed will lend against the original dollar, which I would love to do that. I have bought stocks that have gone down 90%, and I would be thrilled if the bank would give me a loan on the full dollar at a friend rate and a forever loan. Okay, I would love that. That is a pre-bailout.
And I think people don't really rationalize what occurred because people are now in the mindset of, oh, shit hits the fan. It's fine. They got it. They'll figure it out. They'll use their tools, air quotes, their tools. And
their tools.
In reality, their tools are just stuffed from us, the commoners, right?
That's correct.
So go ahead.
Right. So on the one hand, I don't think it's likely that we're going to have the, sort of Armageddon, not the next couple of years here. But what I think is likely is that the way that they're going to stop Armageddon is by pumping out more and more and more money. So that does two things. It creates more inflation than would otherwise be the case. And it means that the final collapse is going to be that much greater. Now, you can still have months where inflation is going down, right? We just had a report this morning that was disinflationary, meaning in the year-on-year inflation came down. But and that's because recessions always cause inflation to go down, right? When the economy starts collapsing, like the real economy, people actually making things, when that starts collapsing, then inflation always comes down. Just people hoard money, credit evaporates. So we could still have up and down months for sure. We're not necessarily talking about inflation going to the moon from here, but I think that what we are getting to the point is where the crises are so unsustainable that they are going to have to keep pumping out trillion after trillion. And it's sort of like storing energy in a battery. That's storing up inflation that is eventually going to crash out. So I feel very confident buying hedges against the US dollar, but really against every currency in the world, right? Because every other country tries to keep their currency weak so they can subsidize exports. So whatever the dollar does, pretty much everybody has to do. So inflation hedges, meaning gold, Bitcoin, real estate, real assets. Of course, your skills hold up value quite well. Stocks actually do surprisingly well in hyperinflationary periods. That was during the Weimar crisis when hyperinflation was taking off. The first couple of months, Germans weren't talking about the hyperinflation. They were talking about the stock market, man. It was exciting. Your stock would go up 1,000-fold, 1,000,000-fold.
And then
it was only later. Yeah, exactly. Right.
But I'm glad that you're affirming part of a hypothesis I've been formulating. And I'm going to hit you with something that you maybe haven't looked at yet. maybe don't like, but it is something with my it is something with my years of researching that I think is coming. I
Right.
do think we're gonna hit inflation again. There's no way they cannot print more money. Right now, we're seeing all these interest rate hikes. They're gonna pause and eventually pivot. Um,
Yeah.
Typically, I observe that whenever they pivot in short order, maybe a couple months, there's typically quite a nasty crash that follows. So that's something that was kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah.
And I think that in '08 we had a massive liquidity crisis, and I believe that out of the ashes of that, that's when Bitcoin was formed, sound money. That's this whole Bitcoin idealism came from. I think that Bitcoin is solid. It's a great store of value, but I think it's failed as a international payment system, and I don't think it's going to be adopted by the banks. I think there's going to be a massive banking crisis, potential bank runs, maybe some freezes here and there, like they've hinted at. And XRP is uniquely positioned with all their banking partnerships with their CBDC platform and their CBDC pilots to help unlock a lot of the nostro vostro value and help unlock a lot of liquidity that's idly standing by, right, to help with inflation, to help with UBI, right? Because I think UBI is coming. I think in order to combat automation, AI, the layoffs, recession, and maintain order amongst the population, they're going to have to give people some money. And there's going to be no better way than with CBDCs, and the way they'll sell it to people is we have these fast transactions with low fees, and you don't have to transfer value with these clogged drains in the financial system. And it's a very interesting narrative that I've been looking into deeply, and I think they need a crisis as a catalyst to really bring this on, and especially looking at this case that XRP has been going through for the past couple of years, finally ramping up into a conclusion. I think it may be a time where things are finally they might be positioned pretty well. I'm curious to know your take on what I said.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right that UBI is coming. That I think is pretty much consensus among the sort of skeptical economists, is that the next crisis, which is most likely going to be the next recession here, unless they invent a new disease, the next crisis, they're absolutely going to pair a UBI with a CBDC, and that's going to be irresistible for, anyway, 51% of voters again. So yeah, I think without a doubt they're going to try to install it. I think the US has a bulwark. It's probably one of the countries most able to resist the CBDC, just because we have a constitution. That constitution actually, strictly speaking, the constitution says that only states can print money, and they can only make it out of gold and silver, which is kind of fun. But anyway, the constitution is currently in exile.
That's gone down the drain, right?
Boy, oh boy. Yeah, well, FDR packed the court back in the 1930s. And if you read the Supreme Court decisions before he started threatening to pack the court and after, boy, oh boy, it's a very different constitution. What do you know? It worked. They greenlighted a whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, I think without a doubt, they are going to try to push a UBI. I think the vast majority of people are going to fall for it. If we learn one thing from COVID, it's that the people sell their soul cheap. Yes, they will absolutely try to install it. They'll probably try to install it everywhere in the world. There's, those of us who fight CBDCs have been shocked by the amount of money and resources that are pushing this thing. The public hates CBDCs everywhere. I mean, they poll like 20%. You could, cholera probably polls 20%. I mean, that's rough. Like by 4 to 5 voters hate the idea. They do not want a CBDC, but they keep pushing and pushing, which I presume, there are companies with a crap load of money that are pushing for this. And for sure, they're waiting for the next crisis to install that thing. In terms of where do people go next, those of us who want a lifeboat, who are trying to escape from the CBDC dystopia, it comes down to lifeboats. I don't think Bitcoin is ready. Not enough people know about it. as you said, the payment technology on Bitcoin, I think, is still not mature. It's super for store of value for large transactions, but the Lightning Network has some scalability issues. It's very Baroque. If you sort of compare the beautiful elegance of Bitcoin itself, and then you compare that to Lightning Network, there's a difference. So I think definitely Bitcoin needs work on the payment side if it is to become a sort of daily use currency. Now, most currency is held as long-term savings. You can find these in the M1, M2 measures that every country comes out. M2 is basically savings. M1 is basically checking accounts, more or less like a wallet. Most money is long-term savings. So I think Bitcoin has a bright future. But in terms of replacing people's daily money usage, I don't think it's great. Gold, of course, historically is the go-to lifeboat when the government screws up currency. And the problem today, of course, is that almost all transactions are done remotely. When's the last time you've handed somebody a piece of paper, or even just zapping it over your phone person to person? So gold coins, it's not going to be gold coins, right? I mean, you would have trouble buying stuff on Amazon using gold coins. So I think that because people are familiar with gold, I think that if the currency system collapses, then the most likely heir initially, the most likely inheritor is going to be gold initially, and then Bitcoin probably gets market share. But in both cases, we're talking long-term store of value. Yes, that's about 80% of money, but still it leaves an opening for means of payment. On means of payment, it's an open question. If the inflation is bad but not horrific, if it's 20, 30% a year, then people are probably overwhelmingly going to stay with dollars, even in CBDC form. Most normies don't think very much about what they spend. They just want to know, will they take it at 7-Eleven? If inflation is substantially higher than that, then I think at some point people have to look at some other crypto that's not a stable coin. And then, it's sort of a cage fight between things like Monero, Dash, granted Ripple, other coins like that. And, probably the most important thing there is going to be the supply constraints. So how hard is the crypto compared to, say, gold or Bitcoin?
I have a question for you. Do you believe that XRP is competing with fiat?
I think they're trying to. I mean, my general take of XRP is that they are trying to become at least initially, an interbank currency. Banks in general weren't terribly enthusiastic because if they're going to use a de novo crypto, why not just make their own and keep the seigniorage profits? So I think in a sense, XRP failed in its original business plan. Banks have not widely adopted it. And so XRP is sort of seeking out is sort of reinventing itself now apparently as a CBDC installer. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I think it was trying to sort of become an interbank rail. And I don't think it was ever trying to compete directly with fiat just because interbank rails, it's kind of an attractive business on its own. And it's separate from sort of retail users of currency.
If I told you it was complementing the CBDC system and everything they were trying to do, would that be more convincing to you as potentially being adopted as an interbank payment system?
Well, I think when banks push a CBDC, they're not. I mean, why would the banks go out of their way to use a private sector crypto alternative? They would just use the CBDC.
The reason is because none of the banks trust each other, and XRP can be used as a neutral bridge asset to convert the CBDCs in between the transactions. So as opposed to the current system now that fails around 5% of the time and is unbelievably expensive, you can send money within 3 seconds for less than a penny.
Yeah, and then at that point, it's a question of what are the performance, parameters of a CBDC. And, as far as trust goes, that's part of the reason why banks use the Fed to settle payments, is because they feel that they can trust the Fed because they control it, rather than having to trust each other. So I mean, in my view, that's part of why I think Ripple is being wrongheaded in pushing for this CBDC thing, because at best they'll be a contractor. No country is going to use a private currency to replace their own, if only out of pride, but fundamentally they want the seigniorage. They don't want Ripple investors to get the seigniorage, or Ripple founders. So they're going to hog it all. I think they're using Ripple as a useful idiot.
I respect that take. I'm not gonna combat it too much, but they're not here. But I respect the take. I respect the take.
I gotta share my thoughts, and it is entirely possible that Ripple goes up a crap load from here. And if you exit at the right time, I'm sure, you know,
because
anything can happen, but long term.
I like listening to people with differing opinions that are respectful and not cult-like, because ultimately I think we got trapped in echo chambers, and in those echo chambers we can't see what other people may see, and there are valuable critiques outside of those echo chambers that are very important. So I like hearing that. Right.
And you know, the way I look at it is I spent all day fighting communists who wanted to throw us all into camps 2 years ago. Okay. So if you and I differ on this, no, I mean, look, we're on the same side on 99.9%.
No, we are. Yes, we are. We're just grappling with which coin we think might do better.
That's exactly what it is.
But not with the overall where the world is going and what we believe in. So that's why it's fun. That's why it's fun. But last question, because I do want to know this point, and then I won't take too much more of your time. You've been amazing, brother. I'm curious to know what you see with the BRICS payment system that they're trying to launch, because BRICS, I believe, is launching to be a direct competitor with SWIFT. And I think part of the reason why I'm such a big XRP guy is because I think the US dollar dominance has overstepped quite a bit, especially with Iran, with Korea, Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine war and the sanctions. That's a big reason why I think that XRP could gain subtraction as an alternative payment system, because a lot of people, they get exiled from the world economy, right? And with XRP, you can kind of circumvent that. I'm curious to know your take on just the BRICS as a whole and anything you've heard.
Yeah, so I think the sort of background here is that the US is shooting itself in the foot in terms of keeping reserve currency status. I mean, just to an unbelievable degree. Absolutely. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the petrodollar narrative and you know, the lengths that the US has gone through to protect the US as the reserve currency, and to just be throwing it away like this is shocking. The adults are very much not in charge. And, you know, really the big one that they did last year when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US seized 300 billion in sovereign dollars that belong to the Russian central bank. And that's about 4 trillion for US listeners in terms of the size of the economy. All right. So that's really a lot. And they did it because they were trying to set off bank runs, which didn't happen. Ironically enough, our banks started collapsing for separate reasons. But anyway, what that sort of showed really every country in the world is that the US can take your dollars anytime they want. And in fact, they can take them all at once to intentionally crash you. In other words, they can weaponize your dollars against you. And keep in mind, the US did not do that even during the Cold War. Right? We had hot proxy wars going on all over the world, and the US did not take the Soviet dollars. And the reason is because the US foreign policy was run by adults who knew that you want even your enemies to be dependent on you. And what's happened now, so starting with Russia, now the US is starting to become a lot more aggressive towards even other countries. So they just bullied Uganda about 2 weeks ago. Because they don't like, Uganda's LGBT laws. And so, you know, now they're going to they're threatening to shut off Uganda's duty-free access for hundreds of goods. Uganda is, of course, an impoverished country. That sort of a change can have a big impact. I mean, it could potentially cause riots. It's a big deal.
The biggest the biggest thing that set alarm bells in my head that let me know, oh, good Lord, something big is coming, is the Iran-Saudi kind of truce,
Yeah, wasn't that something? Yeah, incredible.
Like you bring those two to the table,
yeah,
in harmony against the US, you have something big going on, So
yeah, you're
it's
absolutely right. Yeah, yeah. So the U.S. has been doing these own goals, and exactly like you say, Saudi, that had always been one of the pillars of the petrodollar system. France, is now buying LNG through, I think it's through Qatar or Dubai, in Chinese yuan. So there are these cracks appearing, and because of the U.S. aggressiveness, there are a ton of countries that are fleeing the dollar as fast as they can. Now, in the meantime, China, of course, sees an opportunity, and China is much cleverer than the US. And so they are offering cheap loans through development banks. They're trying to entice countries away from the US, which, by the way, wasn't that hard. There was I think it was Larry Summers who said, he was comparing how the US and how China approach Africa, for example, that he said, when the US shows up, they show up, or I'm sorry, when China shows up, they show up with a checkbook or an airport. When the US shows up, they show up with a lecture. And it's a true story, right? Because China's deal with countries all over the world is, we want to help you get rich so that you can buy Chinese goods. And, this is very much in the interest of a country like Philippines or Nepal or Uganda. They want to get rich too. The individuals in those countries would love to get rich. They're happy to buy Chinese products if they're rich. They want to be like Singapore or Japan. So China is offering something that all these countries deeply, deeply want. On the other hand, the US shows up and talks about LGBT. We had flags. We had like pride flags flying in Libya, in Afghanistan. You've got to be kidding. Like, at some point, come back to reality, people. That's going to feel like cultural imperialism. It's going to feel like bullying to these countries. So the US is really its own worst enemy, and China is very enthusiastically taking advantage of it. And, there's sort of two ways this can play out, which I call the conventional and the nuclear. The conventional is that both sides just keep doing what they're doing. So the US keeps doing stupid things, and China keeps bribing countries to pull them out of the US orbit. Of course, once you pull a country into your new orbit, right, BRICS is sort of being set up as this anti-dollar coalition. Once you pull countries into your orbit, now you can start asking them to do things for you. Okay, so in other words, there may be ties with the US dollar, where a country like Brazil or South Africa may as well keep hold of them. And China says, well, we do ask, it's like The Godfather, I may come to you one day and ask for a favor. And so, this could shut countries out even more completely. That is probably a long process. It's probably a 5, 10, 20-year process. So that brings us to the second possibility, which is the nuclear one. That one is where China or Russia or some combination of them back a new BRICS currency with physical commodity, most likely gold. If they do that, that is an absolute game changer. Because at that point, the US dollar becomes, it's no longer having to compete with other paper currencies. Now it's actually got to compete with the real deal.
And as we both know, Peter, the US dollar isn't, let's be real, it's not backed by anything other than the power of the US monetary.
Yep.
That's it.
The US dollar works like a crypto token. You print up a bunch of tokens, you see what the price is. It's true. It's true. It is the exact, it's literally a model in stablecoins. It's called an algorithmic central bank. You flush out a bunch of tokens, you see what the price is. If the price is too high or too low, you reach in and buy some or sell some. That is literally what the US dollar is. It is it's a shit coin.
And I think there's no way we could top the conversation by continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, ultimately the US dollar is a shit coin, and on a long enough time frame, it will go towards zero, right?
Yes, sir.
I think we both here, me and Peter, we both advocate for getting on your lifeboats, some metals, some solid high quality cryptos. You like BTC, I like XRP. Decide, ladies and gentlemen, decide. I think my audience will decide one way. But anyways, it's very serious times. And I brought Peter on here because he's a very smart economist. He's very, as you can all tell, he has his ears to the streets as far as geopolitically is concerned. What's going on overseas, what's going on here in the United States. And I really appreciate you taking the time out, sharing your knowledge with everyone. And I think it was a breath of fresh air to see some people with a lot of principles that are common, maybe some little disagreements, but let's maybe teach some people how to talk, because people need to learn how to talk again nowadays, right? So,
Definitely. All right, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and absolutely, I'm all for open-minded discussion. We fight enough with the other side.
Yes,
I like some intelligent conversation on our side. So, yep.
I appreciate it, brother. Much love.
All right.
God bless. Thank you, everyone at home, and peace out.